In this video, we cover Game 3 of the 2021 World Chess Championship. My name's Nathan, and this is MTX Chess. Alright, welcome back everyone to Game 3 of the 2021 World Chess Championship between Grandmaster Ian Nepomniachtchi of Russia as the challenger and Magnus Carlsen, the world champion of Norway. So in this game, Nepo has the white pieces and Magnus has the black pieces, and let's just jump right in. So Nepo with e4, this is Nepo's second game playing white. We have e5 from Magnus, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5. So we find ourselves in a Ruy Lopez, very similar to game 1, which Nepo also had the white pieces in game 1. After a6, the Morphy defense. For those of you new to chess, after a6, white has the option, obviously, of capturing this knight. And if you're new to chess, that may make a lot of sense simply because now this pawn becomes very weak. But after d takes c, knight takes e5, black has queen e7, and this knight has to come off the square. Then for instance, if the knight comes here, the pawn falls. So even if white tries to defend something like d4, black's going to end up pushing the knight off the square anyway with something like f6, and black's just better here. They'll have a well-developed queen. So those of you who are new to chess may not be familiar with the Ruy Lopez. That's why white, you rarely see grandmasters capturing here. This would be called the Ruy Lopez exchange variation. Here Nepo plays bishop a4, and after knight f6, castle kingside, bishop e7, rook e1, b5 by Magnus, bishop e3, castle kingside. We find ourselves in the same position we were in game 1. So in game 1, you may remember from this position, and you may, if you watched one of my previous videos, we discussed that Nepo just elected to play h3, and this is kind of considered an anti-martial line of the Ruy Lopez. The most common move in this position is c3, which invites the martial attack with black playing d5. Obviously, game 1, Nepo elected for playing h3, and they ended up getting into a middle game and an end game where Magnus had a slight edge, and I think with more exact play, Magnus could have converted a victory in that first game. If you remember, after h3, Magnus played knight e5, which is a bit of a surprise, sacrificing the pawn and eventually picking off the bishop. So in this game, we don't see h3 from Nepo. Instead, we see a4. So it's interesting to think about kind of what his seconds must have considered in the lines in the day they had of analysis between games. And why h3 wasn't played. But anyway, so a4 was on the board. Here, the obvious threat is that if white captures this pawn can't capture back because the rook will hang. So Magnus defends the rook with bishop b7. Then we have d3 from white, d6, knight bd2, rook e8, all very standard moves. Rook e8 is a bit of a sideline, to be totally honest with you. It's not the most common. But after knight f1, we have h6 for Magnus, bishop d2. The point of this bishop d2 move is to take away this really nice a5 square from the black knight. Obviously, the black knight would love to come to the square in exchange for the bishop. And a lot of times what you'll see in Ruy Lopez is that the knight comes to a5, putting pressure on this bishop. And even if the exchange doesn't occur with the bishop, black plays knight a5 in preparation for pushing c5 and getting really great control of this d4 square. So this bishop d2 move basically prevents any of that from happening. Here Magnus played bishop f8, and then we have knight e3 from white, knight e7. Obviously, this knight can't come to a5 and allowing for c5 to happen, so Magnus has to come up with something else. He decides to push the knight back and allow c5 to happen anyway. Here, white played c4. The idea of c4 is that this black pawn is exerting some control over the c4 square. This would be a great square for white to get their knight onto. So playing c4 for Nepo allows an exchange to happen on that square, and Nepo ends up with this really just well-posted knight on c4. And that's exactly what happened in the game. So in this position, Magnus, I think showing his preparation for this game, didn't hesitate and played knight c6. So if we kind of map out the way this knight has maneuvered in this game, right? So it started on this square, came to this square, moved back, and now Magnus just returned it back to this square. And he played this move pretty quickly. I think if we go back, let me just take a look. So yeah, it took him about 2 minutes to come up with this move. So I think it's not really the first move you consider. It's a little bit counterintuitive to just rotate the knight right back to the same square it came from. But I think it just goes to show you the level of preparation that Magnus had. I think realizing here in this position, if you remember, the initial reason for moving the knight back was so that you could push c5. But if we look here, black's light squares have become very weak. These squares are fairly weak, and pushing c5 these squares will continue to be weak. Also, because of this knight outpost, black has it behooves black to control this b6 square. So pushing this c pawn really is no longer in the best interest for black. And so Magnus, realizing that, and I think rooted a little bit in his preparation, very quickly plays the knight c6 move. After rook c1, a5. An interesting move here. Obviously, trying to give black a little bit of space, control this b4 square, and also avoiding anything of any ideas of white bringing the bishop to this square and kind of exerting some pressure on the center by pinning this pawn. Interesting here. An interesting idea for white would be kind of retreating the knight back to f3 and then cycling the bishop to this this nice little outpost for the bishop. You can see here black's light colored squares are pretty weak in this position. After bishop c3 for white, Magnus, again, I think showing his preparation in this line, recycling the bishop off of this b7 square to this what's going to eventually become this much more active e6 square, obviously with ideas of supporting d5 for the eventual break through the center. Again, not a very intuitive move to retreat the knight in the opening, or excuse me, to retreat the bishop in the opening. But I think Magnus, both with the knight move where he cycled the knight back and forth, and then this bishop move where he's maneuvering the bishop, I think really goes to show you how well prepared Magnus is for some of these deep Ruy Lopez lines. White tries to break through in the center with d4. We have exchange on d4, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4. And much of that was really forced. In this position, Magnus plays bishop e6. And Nepo went into a deep think here, and it's unclear really what to do. Because black is going to be pushing here. So for instance, if you push up here, you just get d takes e5. The center kind of falls apart for white. White has ideas of c6 and then d5. Obviously, if you're considering kind of white's position, this pawn looks pretty weak. But after knight takes, for instance, if like knight were to take the pawn, black would have c5. Now the queen has to move out the square. And what the c5 move does is white has to spend a tempo moving the queen, and this bishop's going to fall, right? So, and also it's kind of a discover attack here on the knight. So for instance, how would this line go forward? After bishop takes b3, we might get something from black like e5, and after bishop takes a4, e takes f6. And here the position's gotten very complicated, but we're basically going to be having is just a ton of exchanges, and this kind of brings us into a pretty quiet endgame and very even endgame. So I think the players, Nepo especially, decided against any type of capturing here on a5, realizing that the result would just be a bunch of exchanges, and he elected to play h3. Magnus, preparing to push and break through the center with d5, decides to support it with c6. In this position, you probably could just push d5 right away after pawn takes, bishop takes, or after pawn takes, queen takes, you get a queen exchange, for instance. After these moves right here, the position's looking just very drawish. So Magnus, instead of pushing d5 right away, prepares it with c6. Nepo decides to kind of remaneuver this bishop with c2. And then Magnus finally pushes towards the center with d5. And so this is kind of a very interesting position for white and for white here. So obviously, like we said, I think capturing e takes d5 is going to result in just really exchanging everything down. And that's not really, I think, what Nepo is going for, especially here as white. And so Nepo decides to play e5. And again, an interesting position here. You might be as tempted as black to protect this knight, for instance, bringing the knight back. But the problem with this position is that white has knight d6. So this is a great knight, another monster knight. You don't really want to give up the bishop for this knight, even though you really have to in this position, simply because this dark square bishop is so important. If you look at white's pawns, they're on light squares, so the dark square bishop is very important for black. So giving that up wouldn't be great. And then even if in this position, let's say black tried something else, like pushing the queen off of this really important d4 square, the problem here is that the queen just falls back to d3, and now white is threatening checkmate on h7, and the black rook is hanging. So this is obviously losing for black. And if we go back, if the bishop were to capture after the pawn captures here, you can't even remaneuver to capture the pawn because white is threatening checkmate on g7. So unpleasant scenarios for black if they try to hold on to this knight. So the best move in this position is d takes c4, and that is the move Magnus played. And then here, exchanges can happen in kind of different move orders. Nepo elected to exchange queens right away. Magnus kind of thought about this. He decided to take with the rook on the e file, and that makes sense because you want this rook coming to b8 because this pawn is really the key weakness of white's position after the major and minor pieces come off the board. So rook e takes d8, e takes f6, and here Magnus played bishop b4. So what's the point of bishop b4? Obviously, this is a monster bishop right here, and it really, black needs to get this bishop off the board. So for instance, if black were to make the mistake of taking this pawn here, white would have bishop takes f6 with attack on the rook, and after the rook moves, white has ideas of rook e3 with the rook coming over, and this is just really powerful and going to be too much for black to handle. So getting that dark square bishop off the board was really a great idea. There were other ideas of in this position, for instance, rook a b8, putting pressure on this weak b2 square. The idea being that if black can somehow exchange off white's dark squared bishop, that this pawn would become really weak. So for instance, if one continuation may have been bishop or f takes g7, and then after bishop takes g7, get some ideas of exchanges happening on this diagonal. And so like a really bad continuation for white would be something like this, and now this pawn is very weak. Obviously white's not gonna go for that. What white is going to do is they're going to sit with this bishop on c3, and if black does exchange this bishop, then the pawn will just come to c3 and kind of eliminate this weakness here. Magnus obviously doesn't go for any of that, and instead just plays bishop b4, going for the exchange outright. White obviously does not want to capture here because then black just gets these fantastic pawns together, and they're just going to march them right down white's throat. So here we have f takes g7 for white, bishop takes c3, b takes c3. Now there's no longer a weak pawn on this b file. And after king j takes f7, we reach kind of a your classic bishop rook and really rook pawn endgame. And if you're ever in these kinds of endgames, the goal is always to get control of your opponent's 7th rank. So for Magnus, that looks like bringing the rook down to d2, bringing the rook over to b8, and then down to b2. And so Nepo, knowing that, plays a very logical move, and that is king f1. And so what's the purpose of this move? If Magnus tries something like rook d2, white can play rook e2. And so even if, and obviously, you're either going to exchange on the 2nd rank here, and white's king's going to come even further towards the center of the board, or the black rook's just going to come back. Alternatively, the king f1 works really well because if black decides to try and control the b file and get control of this b2 square, white can just exchange the rooks here, and black may be thinking that, oh, because this rook has moved away, now I've got control of the second rank. But after white plays king e1, there's really nowhere for this rook. Or excuse me, white would obviously have to defend the bishop here, and then depending on, black might play a move like getting their king to the center, and then after a move like king e1, this rook gets pushed up that 2nd rank. So really not a very clear way for Magnus to establish any type of position on white's 2nd rank after Nepo plays the great king f1. Magnus continues with rook b8. We have rook b1, king f6. White exchanges the rooks, and after rook b1, rook take b1, bishop takes b1. Now we're in a position where the rooks have been exchanged, but black had that extra move to centralize their king. After king e5, king e2, f5. Black doesn't want white to expand too much on the king side with their pawn, so they play f5, bishop c2, f4, bishop b1, c5, bishop c2, bishop d7. You can see here that black has this very nice position where, because this is a light squared pawn, this pawn's on a light square, the white bishop is going to be really tied down to the defense of this pawn. f3 for white, king f6, h4, king e5, king f2, king f6, king e2, king e5. You can see the players are really kind of just dancing around at this point. And king f2, this was move 41, and it was in this position on move 41 of the game that the players agreed to a draw. There's really no way for either player to break through. Again, the light square bishop here for white is really tied down in the defense of this a4 pawn. If this pawn were to fall, the game would basically be over. It would be such an advantage for black to have a passed outside a pawn. These double pawns here, they can't create a pass pawn, but at the same time, it's very difficult for the black king to approach these pawns because these pawns control these two squares. And then there's really not a way for a white to break through on the king side. Obviously, if they push here, we get en passant. This bishop's taking away this diagonal. And I think with there's no way for the black king to make any progress because the pawns control these squares. So the black king's never going to get beyond the fifth rank here. So there you have it. Game 3 of the 2021 World Chess Championship ending in a draw. This is the third consecutive draw for this match, and the 17th consecutive draw in World Chess Championship play. If you remember, in 2018, Fabiano Caruana versus Magnus Carlsen, they drew all 14 games, and Magnus ended up winning in the Blitz tiebreaks. So a great game. I think Magnus showing his preparation, especially in these Ruy lines. It'll be interesting to see what Nepo does when he has the white pieces again, if he's going to continue trying to kind of beat his head against a wall and trying to beat Magnus in these Ruy lines that I think he's shown he's really well versed in. So exciting stuff. Tomorrow is a break day. The players have the day off, and I'm sure we will see a lot of fireworks over the board in 2 days on Wednesday. Or on Tuesday, excuse me, when Magnus has the white pieces, and it'll be interesting to see if he comes out with a closed Catalan again. So, thank you for watching this video. As always, like and subscribe, and please comment. You can always hit me up on chess.com, username MTXChessOfficial. Look forward to seeing you guys in 2 days.